Welcome to the Tea Party with Marty Abernathy, a show by an ultra-feminine, meek, shy, totally unopinionated trans woman that seeks to listen to both sides and does not make fun of TERFs. You've listened to the show, right? You still want me to say this? Okay. Here's your host, Marty Abernathy.
That's right. I don't make fun of TERFs ever, at all, period. End of story. Today on the show, I'm glad to welcome Cristan Williams of Trans Advocate fame. At least that's where I know her from. She saved Trans Advocate from disaster, which is me. Cristan, can you hear me okay?
I can.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you good. I need to set my music back a little bit. The reason why that I wanted to have you on the show today, I wanted to talk about phenotype and genotype. TERFs like to use arguments like a woman is not a feeling. Sex-based rights are just common sense biology 101. And trans people have been evolving on understandings of how they see their gender incongruence. Back when I transitioned in 2001, there was a standard narrative that was generally used in the media, but it was the whole born in the wrong body thing. At first, I used it because it was kind of the best way to describe how my gender identity manifested itself over the decades. But it really got to a point where it felt very itchy because it didn't seem like it was really authentic for me. It was a very rough way to describe what this felt like, but it really wasn't accurate because there's nothing wrong with my body. I was just fixing what I felt uncomfortable with. So that being said, I've seen you debate the anti-trans brigade on Twitter, and you've been quite successful. But probably the most effective talking point I've seen you use is when you talk about phenotype and genotype. And while I think you're quite successful in talking to academics or talking to TERFs that know a lot of feminist theory, I think some of the verbiage can get kind of hard to. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of when I was in high school and we were going over Romeo and Juliet. Like, you had to basically take parts of it and rip it apart because the language was so foreign to us that to understand it, you kind of had to get involved in that culture and understand what everything meant, the context of it. So what I really want to talk about is phenotype and genotype. Genotype is the genetic constitution of an individual organism. I actually got that definition from transadvocate.com. Glossary. Yes, you too can visit there. But as a trans person myself, regardless of what TERFs think, I've never questioned my genetics. I know what they probably are. That being said, the word woman seems to me to be a word that we used on how people are perceived rather than their actual genetic markers. And even though there's variance in that, you can talk to biologists and they'll tell you it's a spectrum and it's not a binary. When you talk about phenotype, can you talk about what that is and how we can use that kind of terminology to better explain our experience?
Sure. So I want to take a step back and recognize rhetoric and discourse really, it constructs the way people see us, understand us. It's the way that we understand our place aside from other people, how we interact with them, how we are related, interrelated within culture and society. It defines all of it. Any other bigot. They are very good at smuggling in some rather toxic notions in the rhetoric that they use. For instance, sex. That's a very good way of smuggling in the pernicious idea that bodies come in two types, and these types each have one or the other set of phenotypic features, attributes, body attributes. There's a bucket that has all of these male body attributes, and there's this other bucket that has all these female body attributes. And that these are two distinct buckets. There's no gray in between. And, that's how it is, because sex is binary and phenotype is an aspect of sex. And therefore, there are these two buckets. And that when I medically transitioned, I didn't change anything about my sex. That is, that my phenotype, my sex phenotype didn't change. That's false. That's absolutely false. It's a way of ensuring that one's identity can never be recognized, because if phenotype attributes aren't an aspect of sex, which they are, you look at in a biology book, they're always appealing to biology. You see that organisms have sex attributes, and these attributes are called phenotype, sex phenotype. And although the language that trans people use to describe the dysphoria many of us who seek medical intervention are dealing with is about phenotype, that it's phenotype dysphoria. We call it gender dysphoria because that's the language that was handed to us. You mentioned the born in the wrong body trope, and that's indicative of the language that we're stuck with for trans people. A lot of these terms and languaging aspects of language, they were given to us. They're part of our culture, our wider culture. So that Harry Benjamin back in 1966 was trying to describe what the trans experience is to a cisgender audience. And so his analogy was saying it's like being born in the wrong body. And that became shorthand for the trans experience, because that is what a cis man said the trans experience is. That's what cis people heard. And so when trans people, especially trying to access medical care or psychological care, wanted to express their experience, the shorthand for that was born in the wrong body. And so TERFs and other sex essentialist activists make a lot of hay over this thing, this born in the wrong body, as if that was the thing that we came up to describe our own experience. It wasn't. It was a cis person's analogy that we then used because at that time, back in the 60s and 70s, these cis individuals were the gatekeepers. They were the ones who would, that our lives hung in the balance. They had the power. They had the so-called, this power knowledge, this idea that they're creating a way of understanding the trans experience, and because they come out of academia, out of medical context, that then becomes the official, the real experience. That experience is reified, naturalized.
Do you mean in kind of like how I'm thinking of, God, I can't remember her name, but she's the one that coined this term, DSD for intersexed people.
Yeah, you're talking about, so do you mean it as in disorders or diversity?
Disorders.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea that if you exist outside of those two buckets and people notice, then you're disordered. And many intersex advocates came forward and said, yeah, DSD, fuck that. The D stands for diversity, you know, and difference. And I think that that's great because so many times the language that we have that is official, that's real, is given to us, and we have to do with it what we can, because that language gets worked into policy, it gets worked into law, it gets worked into medical understandings, and so with languages like sex or born in the wrong body or even gender identity, a lot of these terms are things that were given to us by a largely cisgender heteronormative society. And we use them to describe something that is not cisgender heteronormative. And we run into a lot of talking past each other. And so even though these terms might sound like phenotype and genotype, might sound strange or academic or lofty or something, they are in fact more precise. That shortcuts the sneaking in of transgender people aren't biological. Excuse me, my body is biological. My phenotype is not rubber, it's not made out of metal, it is biological.
You're not a robot?
I know, right? Right? So the whole idea of being more precise with our language and kind of standing up and saying, no, this is really what I mean. When I say that my issue at 5 years old for me wasn't that I liked pink, my issue was my body attributes, my phenotype. That was what I was praying about. That was what I anguished over. And to have someone on Twitter oftentimes say, well, you know, if you could have just, you know, if it could have just been okay for you to like pink, that would have resolved the issue. Those types of assertions completely miss the point, and the misunderstandings are compounded because we have decades of official narratives around gender identity and gender dysphoria that don't actually reflect the trans experience. Instead, they reflect what generally Dr. Green, Dr. Zucker, Dr. Blanchard thought. Even Dr. Ricker, I mean, he worked with Dr. Green to fix transgender children, and his reparative therapies were later implicated in the deaths of some of these kids, but they had the belief that my issue, our issue, was gender roles and gender stereotypes, and if those could be ironed out, then trans people wouldn't be trans anymore. And it didn't matter how many times someone like me said, my issue is my phenotype. They nodded their head and said, yes, your issue is gender role. So, and that is, in fact, what TERFs do. That's all that they do. They equivocate about these terms, and to support their claims, they often call back to these disco-era research papers that use terms in the way that they do, very unnuanced, very almost totalitarian in practice, so that these are the ways terms are used. Sex means genitals, and what gamete size. That's what sex means.
That's common. You'll hear people literally on Twitter arguing over gametes.
Mm-hmm.
It's so absurd.
As if that my material experience in society is about my gamete size. That's not what my day-to-day experience in society is predicated upon. It's predicated upon my gender expression that communicates my experience of phenotype. That's what it's based upon. So I had a situation several years ago where I was unconscious and was raped by a heterosexual man. He didn't rape me because he thought, oh, wow, I'm really attracted to those gametes. That's not what it was. He saw my phenotype, saw a vagina, fucked it, came inside of it, and that has everything to do with the meaning that our patriarchal culture assigns phenotype. It has nothing to do with gametes in that regard. So the idea that sex-based rights can only be gamete size is fucking stupid. And yet, people nod their heads like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense, sex-based rights. When what we're talking about is phenotype. And with regard to genotype, I will hear people essentialize sex as genotype. And, genotype is more than, for instance, the number of estrogen receptors that exist in my cells is determined by my genotype. That is a working aspect of my internal biology. When I take a hormone pill, the way it's processed in my body is about my genotype. The fact that my body resembles the women in my family is about my genotype. So this notion that, you have a male genotype, it's completely male, and it can only, and therefore it's, no. So genotype, if you, in the same way you want to pretend that phenotype is about, gamete size, people can pretend that genotype is only the existence of a Y chromosome. It's not. And when trans people transition, they are leveraging, they are using their genotype to affect their phenotype, just like everyone else in the world does. So whenever I use those terms, phenotype, genotype, I'm merely trying to be more precise and to empower language and rhetoric in a way that we've not taken advantage of historically. Historically, we've tried to use the terms that academics, usually cisgender academics, cisgender medical, psychological systems bestow upon us. And
it's what we're born into.
Yes, exactly. And that rhetoric very much in a material way defines the experience of trans people.
Thank you for coming on the show. I think that's where I'm going to end it.
Right.
I'm not actually going to end it. I'm just going to end the recording. But thank you, Cristan, for coming on the show.
You're listening to The Tea Party, part of the Trans FM radio network. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube and don't forget to click the bell icon to get notified when we go live.